The official designation for my role at Sevran was Spiritual Welfare Attendant, Grade 3. In 11 years, I never met anyone who used the full title. The guards called me chaplain. The processing clerks called me the prayer woman. The prisoners called me nothing at all, or occasionally sister, which I wasn't, or occasionally something worse, which I also wasn't. My supervisor in the Colonial Welfare Bureau, a man I saw twice, once when he hired me, and once when he told me the post was being eliminated, called me Sorn, because he had never troubled himself to learn my first name. By any measure, the least remarkable career a person could construct in 30 years of service. Sevran Holding Block occupied the gutted lower decks of a builder structure that the Colonial Authority had converted, somewhere around the second wave of settlement, into a transit detention facility for minor infractions. Vagrancy, trespass, permit violations, the kind of offenses that generated paperwork and bodies and nowhere to put either. The authority had fitted out the upper levels with standard-issue holding cells and processing bays, and a commissary that smelled of recycled protein and old disinfectant, and they had left the lower decks largely as they had found them. Vast pale corridors in some composite material that no survey team had ever successfully analyzed, ceilings too high for the lighting rigs to reach adequately, and at the very bottom, the room they had labeled ceremonial architecture, non-functional in the original survey and never revisited. The ring room. I found it by accident in my first month at Sevran, following a prisoner who had slipped a processing check and gone deeper into the lower decks than he should have. The prisoner I recovered without incident. The room stayed with me. It was circular, 12 meters across, I estimated, though I never measured it. The walls were panels of the same pale composite as the corridors, but arranged in a continuous ring from floor to ceiling, perhaps 7 meters high, joined at invisible seams. The floor was smooth, the air was still and held no dust, and it was quiet in a way that the rest of Sevran, with its clanging gates and its intercom static, and its permanent background of low human misery, was not. I began eating my lunch there, a habit, nothing more. 11 years of lunches. 11 years of sitting on the floor with my back against one of those pale panels, eating whatever the commissary had assembled that day, and afterwards sitting a while in the quiet, before going back upstairs to do the work nobody thought needed doing. Visits to holding cells, forms for prisoners who couldn't read the intake documents, sitting beside people who had nobody to sit beside them while they waited for processing outcomes that would determine the next several years of their lives. The ring was always cold when I arrived. It was always cold when I left. The survey team had tagged it non-functional. 7,000 years the facility had stood in the outer belt, repurposed and remodeled, and staffed through a dozen Colonial Authority administrative cycles, and in all that time, the ring had not done one thing that could be measured. On my last day at Sevran, I went down at lunch as usual. Director Manick had delivered the news that morning with the efficiency of a man reading a cargo manifest. Facility closure, 48 hours, standard severance documentation via the Bureau's automated system. He paused at the door and added that my years of service were appreciated, in a tone that made clear he was reading from a procedural template. I had thanked him. I had gone back to my broom closet office and sat with my hands flat on my desk, looking at 11 years of small framed documents, and a plant that had died 2 months ago, and a photograph of my mother that I kept not because we had been close, but because she was the one who had taught me the work. My mother had been a hospice attendant on the second settlement tier of Kareth Voss for 34 years. Her mother before her had tended the ward sick in the first wave transit camps, before there were proper facilities for anything. Before that, I didn't know, except that my grandmother had said once, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone reporting a weather reading, that the women in our family had always found their way to the rooms where people suffered, not because anyone asked them to, because the rooms existed and someone had to be in them. I had taken that as simple family character. I collected my coat and the photograph of my mother, and I went down to the ring room one last time. I sat on the floor with my back against the nearest panel. I had brought nothing to eat. I wasn't hungry. The room was as it always was, quiet, still, the pale seams of the panels barely visible in the low ceiling light that filtered down from the corridor outside, cold as always at my back. I don't know how long I sat there. long enough that the recycled air hum of the facility above me became something I stopped hearing. Long enough that my hands, folded in my lap, grew cold. When I stood to leave, I pressed my palm flat against the panel beside me, a gesture I had made 100 times without thinking. The way you put your hand on a wall to steady yourself when your knees have been on a cold floor too long. The panel was warm. I held still. The warmth was not the warmth of ambient temperature rising, not the slow equalization of body heat against composite surface. It was immediate, deliberate. It moved through my palm and up my wrist, and settled in the bones of my forearm, like a current finding a path it had always known was there. The seams between the panels lit, not dramatically, pale and even, a thin line of white gold tracing, each joined from floor to ceiling, the full circumference of the ring, all at once, as though the circuit had simply been waiting for the last connection to be made. The composite surface changed under my hand, still solid, but no longer cold, no longer inert, something behind it awake and attending. The sound reached me through my sternum first, then my jaw, not through the air, bone to bone, the way a low note finds a cavity in your chest before your ears register it as music. It was not a voice in the way a human voice is a voice. It was older than that, and more careful, as though whatever spoke had spent a long time deciding how to be understood. I was not afraid. I noted this distantly, the way you note the weather. The words came in my own language, which I understood later was not a coincidence. Born at whole, first keeper. The ring did not explain itself. It did not offer credentials or history, or the names of civilizations I had never heard of. It spoke 4 words, and then it was quiet, and the warmth held in the panels and in my hand, and in the bones of my forearm, and I stood in that room for a long time, doing nothing at all. What it told me, without telling me, was this. The builders had known that grief was a variable that could not be engineered out of any surviving species. They had known that loss, accumulated and unprocessed, became something else, something rigid and cold that stopped civilizations from healing and started them toward other things. They had tried, across more worlds and more centuries than I could hold in my mind, to find the bearers who could carry grief without calcifying it. Not rulers, not soldiers, not the brilliant or the celebrated. The ones who sat in the rooms, the ones who made 11 years of lunches in a cold ring room because the ring room was quiet, and the work upstairs was hard, and a person needed somewhere to set the weight down for an hour before picking it up again. My mother, her mother, the line of them stretching back through transit camps and ward-sick halls and whatever came before those, each woman finding her way without instruction to the rooms where people suffered, staying, doing the unremarkable work of not leaving. The ring had not been waiting for a hero. It had been waiting for someone who had been doing the work without a name for it. I took my hand from the panel. The pale gold light stayed at the seams. It would stay, I understood, as long as Sevran stood, which might not be long now. Or it might be longer than the colonial authorities' plans for the facility. I had a sense, standing there in the ring's warmth, that the authorities' administrative calendar was not the oldest schedule governing this structure. I picked up the photograph of my mother off the floor where I had set it, and I walked out. Upstairs, the processing bays were already half-packed. Director Manick passed me in the corridor and did not look up from his tablet. The commissary was closed. 2 guards I had worked beside for 6 years were discussing severance pay by the main gate. Nobody asked where I had been. I walked out of Sevran holding block into the pale gray daylight of the outer belt, with the photograph of my mother under my arm, and the warmth of 7,000 years still present in the bones of my hand. I thought about her morning habit, the way she pressed both palms flat to the patient's bed frame before she entered each room. Not a ritual anyone had told her to perform, just something she did. I understood it now. I had always thought we were women who did small work in invisible rooms. It turns out we were the key.